Maya Hawke's story does not begin with applause, opportunity, or privilege the way people love to assume when they hear her last name. It begins instead with pressure, comparison, and an invisible weight that most people never have to carry. Because being born into fame does not mean being born into confidence, and Maya learned this lesson early, growing up in a world where expectations were decided before she ever spoke a line, where strangers already thought they knew her, where her identity was constantly filtered through the success of her parents, and where proving yourself becomes harder, not easier, when the world assumes everything was handed to you. From the outside, her life looked effortless, but inside, it was filled with quiet struggles, learning differences, self-doubt, and a deep desire to be seen for who she actually was, not for the legacy she inherited. And this internal conflict shaped her far more than red carpets ever could. Maya Hawke grew up sensitive, thoughtful, and introspective. Someone who felt deeply and thought carefully, and in an industry that rewards loud confidence. This softness initially felt like a weakness, something she had to hide or overcome just to survive. As a child, Maya struggled with dyslexia, something that made traditional education painful and frustrating, forcing her to work twice as hard just to keep up. And while many people never notice these early battles, they leave permanent marks, teaching resilience long before fame arrives, teaching patience before applause ever does, because every small success had to be earned, not assumed. Acting was not an escape for her. It was a challenge, a place where she had to confront fear, comparison, and judgment head-on, knowing that every audition would be viewed through a lens she didn't choose, a lens shaped by famous names rather than personal effort. When she first entered acting spaces, she wasn't treated like a rising star. She was treated like a question mark, someone people doubted quietly, wondering if she was talented or simply connected, and that doubt followed her into rooms, onto sets, and into conversations she was never part of, forcing her to develop thick skin without losing her sensitivity. A balance few people ever master. Her early auditions were not magical moments of instant acceptance. They were awkward, uncertain, and often unsuccessful, filled with rejection that hit harder because it challenged not just her ability, but her right to be there at all. And instead of quitting, Maya did something quietly brave. She stayed. She studied, she trained, she listened, and she learned how to separate who she was from who people expected her to be. She attended acting school not to polish a brand, but to build a foundation, choosing growth over shortcuts, knowing that respect cannot be inherited, it can only be earned, and this choice slowed her rise but strengthened her core. Every class, every rehearsal, every critique became a way to reclaim her story, to move from being someone's daughter to becoming an artist in her own right, even when the world wasn't ready to see that difference yet. When Maya Hawke finally stepped into the public eye, it wasn't through a loud debut or a forced spotlight. It was through a role that demanded vulnerability, awkwardness, and emotional honesty, and instead of hiding her natural quirks, she leaned into them, allowing her softness, her intelligence, and her quiet humor to exist on screen without apology. This decision was risky because Hollywood often punishes women who don't fit a narrow mold, but it became her defining strength because audiences recognized something real in her, something unpolished and human, and slowly, without marketing tricks or manufactured hype, people started paying attention not to her last name but to her presence. She didn't dominate scenes. She grounded them, offering emotional depth where others might have gone louder. And this restraint gave her performances a lasting impact that lingered long after the screen faded. As fame grew, so did scrutiny, but Maya Hawke refused to perform perfection for public approval, choosing instead to remain thoughtful, introspective, and openly imperfect, speaking honestly about fear, anxiety, creativity, and identity in a world obsessed with confidence and certainty, and this honesty made her relatable in a way few celebrities manage. She didn't rush to define herself narrowly. She explored music, poetry, and storytelling alongside acting, treating creativity as a conversation rather than a competition, and this multidimensional approach protected her from being trapped in a single image, allowing her to grow organically rather than being frozen in one successful moment. While others chased relevance, Maya chased meaning, choosing projects that resonated with her values, even if they didn't guarantee instant fame. And this long-term mindset quietly set her apart. What makes Maya Hawke's journey inspiring is not that she overcame privilege, but that she overcame assumptions, proving that having access does not eliminate insecurity, that opportunity does not erase fear, and that legacy does not replace effort. And through patience, humility, and consistent work, she slowly rewrote the narrative people had written for her before she ever spoke. She learned how to stand inside her own voice without needing to shout, how to accept criticism without letting it define her worth, and how to grow publicly without letting the spotlight distort her sense of self. And these lessons transformed her from a promising newcomer into a respected creative force whose presence feels intentional, grounded, and emotionally intelligent. By the time audiences truly began to appreciate her, Maya Hawke had already done the hardest work privately, building resilience, learning discipline, and developing a sense of identity strong enough to survive fame without being swallowed by it. And this inner foundation allowed her to navigate success with grace, curiosity, and self-awareness rather than entitlement or fear. Her story quietly reminds us that identity is not inherited. Confidence is not automatic, and authenticity is not accidental. It is built slowly through self-reflection, rejection, and the courage to remain honest in environments that reward performance over truth. And this is only the beginning of Maya Hawke's evolution, because what follows is where her story becomes even more powerful. As she steps fully into her creative independence, challenges expectations head-on, and proves that the most meaningful success is not becoming famous, but becoming yourself. As Maya Hawke's visibility increased, something subtle but powerful began to shift, not just in how audiences saw her, but in how she saw herself, because success did not suddenly erase insecurity. It simply changed its shape, and instead of running from that discomfort, she learned to sit with it, to understand it, to let it inform her work rather than control it, and this emotional maturity became one of her defining traits. Fame has a way of flattening people, reducing them to a single image or moment, but Maya resisted that flattening by refusing to rush her evolution, choosing instead to move thoughtfully, aware that identity is something you grow into, not something you declare once and defend forever. With every new role, she showed a deeper understanding of character, nuance, and emotional truth, leaning into complexity rather than safety. And this willingness to be uncomfortable on screen mirrored her willingness to remain open and questioning off-screen, a rare alignment that audiences could feel even if they couldn't explain it. Rather than positioning herself as a flawless success story, Maya allowed space for uncertainty, openly acknowledging that creativity is messy, that confidence is not permanent, and that growth often feels like confusion before it feels like clarity. And this honesty created a quiet bond with people who saw themselves in her journey, especially those who felt overshadowed, misunderstood, or pressured to live up to expectations they never chose. She spoke not as someone who had all the answers, but as someone still asking the right questions. And in a culture that often mistakes certainty for strength, this vulnerability became its own form of power. Each project she chose reflected this mindset, favoring depth over spectacle, character over noise, and emotional resonance over instant validation. And slowly, her body of work began to tell a story far richer than any headline ever could. Maya Hawke's relationship with fame itself remained intentionally distant, almost cautious, as if she understood early that being visible does not mean being fulfilled, and that constant exposure can dilute meaning if you let it. So she protected parts of herself, choosing privacy not out of fear, but out of respect for her inner life. This boundary allowed her creativity to remain sincere rather than reactive, giving her space to write music, explore poetry, and engage with art as a form of self-expression rather than performance. And these creative outlets fed back into her acting, adding layers of emotional intelligence that made her performances feel lived in rather than constructed. She wasn't trying to be everything at once. She was trying to be honest, and that restraint gave her career a sense of direction even as it continued to evolve. As public conversations around identity Individuality and self-definition grew louder. Maya Hawke emerged as a quiet counterpoint, someone who embodied those ideas without turning them into slogans, showing through her actions that authenticity doesn't need to announce itself to be real. She embraced her uniqueness without packaging it, allowing her voice, style, and creative choices to reflect who she was becoming rather than who she was expected to be.